Have you ever heard of the day America's top generals secretly drafted plans to terrorize U.S. cities, sink a refugee boat, and even blow up an American ship just to justify a war? These ideas were not scribbled in the margins of a spy novel. They were written down, stamped top secret, and delivered to the Secretary of Defense. For decades, the paper trail slept in darkness until it was finally declassified and revealed to the world. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history. And the name of the plan was Operation Northwoods. The year was 1962. The Cold War was at its height. Just 1 year earlier, the Bay of Pigs invasion had ended in humiliating failure. Fidel Castro was still in power. Cuba had grown closer to the Soviet Union, and Washington feared the island would become a permanent communist stronghold just 90 miles from Florida. Inside the Pentagon, pressure was building. The White House wanted options. The CIA had already begun sabotage efforts under what became known as Operation Mongoose. But covert operations weren't enough. The call now came for something bigger, something that would give the United States a reason to invade Cuba outright. The request was direct: provide pretexts for U.S. military action. And on March 13, 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff responded with a chilling memo titled, "Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba." It was signed by the chairman, General Lyman Lemnitzer. The proposals inside read like a catalog of false flag operations, scenarios designed to manufacture outrage and pin the blame on Cuba. One plan centered on Guantanamo Bay. The Joint Chiefs suggested staging attacks to make it appear that Castro's forces had struck the U.S. base. They would start rumors over clandestine radio, stage arrests of supposed saboteurs, set fires on the airfield, blow up ammunition, even shell the base from outside the fence to simulate enemy mortar fire. To outside observers, it would look like Cuba had launched an assault. Another section evoked America's own history with a chilling phrase, "Remember the Maine." In 1898, the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor had been the spark for the Spanish-American War. Now, the generals proposed a modern replay. They could blow up a U.S. ship at Guantanamo or destroy an unmanned vessel off the Cuban coast. The explosion would be visible from the shore. The memo even noted that casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would create, in their words, a helpful wave of national indignation. But the document did not stop at ships and bases. It went further into American cities themselves. The Joint Chiefs proposed a communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami, in Washington, and in other cities. Bombings, staged arrests, fake evidence pointing to Castro. The goal was not just to sway opinion abroad, but to terrify the American public into demanding action. Then came one of the darkest ideas: sink a boat filled with Cuban refugees. The document bluntly suggested that the attack could be real or simulated. The sight of grieving families, the stories of innocent lives lost, this would all be used as propaganda to build the case for invasion. In the cold language of the memo, human suffering became a tool. The proposals extended into the skies. The Pentagon recommended creating replica aircraft painted to resemble Soviet-made MiGs. American pilots, flying these disguises, could harass civilian airliners or attack shipping, creating the appearance of Cuban aggression. Even more audacious was a detailed plan involving a civilian passenger jet. According to the memo, an aircraft would take off with real passengers, perhaps a group of college students on a holiday trip. At a secret location, the plane would land, the passengers would be evacuated under aliases, and a remote-controlled drone would take its place. The drone would continue along the planned route, broadcasting a distress signal that it was under attack by Cuban fighters. Then, over the ocean, it would be detonated by radio control. Wreckage would be found. The world would believe a tragedy had occurred, and all fingers would point at Cuba. Another variation outlined how to fake the shoot-down of a U.S. military aircraft. A pilot would fly low, send a scripted Mayday call, then land safely at a hidden base. Meanwhile, debris would be scattered at sea to simulate a crash. Once again, the evidence would be manufactured. The outrage would be real. What makes Operation Northwoods so disturbing is not just the creativity of the proposals, it is their source. These were not ideas from a rogue officer or a single overzealous planner. This was a coordinated memorandum from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military leaders in the United States. The tone of the document is coldly bureaucratic, as if these were logistical exercises, not schemes to deceive the public. There are no moral boundaries in the text. The only limits discussed are practical ones: how to keep the operation secret, how to restrict involvement to the most highly trusted personnel, and how difficult it might be to maintain secrecy after the fact in a democracy. But in 1962, the final decision did not rest with the Joint Chiefs. President John F. Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara reviewed the proposals and said no. Operation Northwoods was rejected. General Lemnitzer was soon reassigned to a NATO command. The plan was buried in the archives, a ghost in a filing cabinet. For decades, the public knew nothing. Historians suspected covert operations against Cuba, but had no idea how far the proposals had gone. It was not until the 1990s, when Congress created the Assassination Records Review Board to release long classified documents, that the memo surfaced. In 1997, Operation Northwoods was declassified. In 1998, the National Security Archive published the documents, and in 2001, journalist James Bamford described the plan as perhaps the most corrupt plan ever created by the US government. The reaction was shock, not because the plan had been carried out, it had not, but because it had been written at all. The idea that America's top military leaders once proposed terror against their own citizens to spark a war left an indelible mark on the historical record. To be fair, history must note again, Operation Northwoods was never executed. Civilian leadership rejected it. But the fact that it was proposed reveals a dangerous temptation, the temptation to manufacture consent, to shortcut democracy by scripting fear. Think about the specific scenes the planners envisioned. A midnight fire at a US base, blamed on Cuba. A refugee boat sinking beneath the waves. A passenger jet exploding over the sea, its supposed passengers gone forever. Each was designed to be a headline, a television image, an outrage ready to be consumed. Why did they believe it would work? Because fear is efficient, outrage is persuasive. And in an age of instant news, the first story told often becomes the story believed. Operation Northwoods forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In times of crisis, even democratic governments can be tempted by deception. And documents like this are not just relics of the past. They are warnings for the present. That is why remembering Northwoods matters. It teaches us to question, to scrutinize, to demand evidence, to look closely at the stories we are told in moments of crisis, and to ask who benefits from the narrative. Operation Northwoods never became America's history, but it remains part of America's record. It reminds us how fragile the line can be between security and manipulation, between protection and propaganda. Half a century later, the lesson is clear. Vigilance is the safeguard of freedom. If you believe stories like this must be told and remembered, help us keep history alive. Subscribe, share this video, and never forget how close we came to a tragedy that would have been written, directed, and staged, not by an enemy, but by our own.